Hi, everybody. I'm Lisi Keeker, the CEO and founder here at Studio Grow. Welcome back to the business of boutique fitness. Today, we're talking about tariffs. Now, I have to say, as I was just telling the team off camera, this is like not something that I ever expected I'd be really eloquently speaking on. But as I'm filming this in May of 2025, and we've seen tariffs, hit really the international stage since February of this year. And quite frankly, I think we're probably going to see some continuing repercussions and continuing waves of tariffs. I think it's a conversation that's really important for us to have, not necessarily because I see mass impact on our industry, but because I see the anxiety that it has created around our industry. I'm going to thank Liz Clark, Mike, the Health and Fitness Association. So a lot of the materials I pulled from this were due to a talk that they did at the Health and Fitness Association flying in Washington D.C. a couple of weeks ago. Along with just conversations, research, the amount of time that we've spent talking with really experts in this field that are sitting here in Charlottesville with us at the University of Virginia to say, hey, what do we need to be concerned about? Where do we need to go? If you are around the world and you're like, wait, I'm not a U.S. citizen, should I be worried about this? I don't have a U.S.-based studio. Yeah, I think most of us know these conversations, these tariffs are impacting people around the world. It was funny. Matt and I were talking about this yesterday. Matt grew up in Melbourne. Yay to all our Australian clients on this. And he said, what's the phrase when the U.S. sneezes, the world gets a cold. There's some truth, unfortunately, to that, to how intertwined our markets are from a global perspective. And so, the fact of the matter is, we've sneezed. We've sneezed a really nasty sneeze of tariffs. And right now, there's reverberations that we're really seeing in studios all across the world. So let's start with the, honest truth. We're looking about uncertainty in three areas. So the first, from the government's perspective. I was just up on the Hill, met with, I'm going to say, roughly a dozen or more congressmen and senators. The one thing that's clear is that from an American legislative perspective, there's a lot of uncertainty about what comes next. A lot of people know that these tariffs are being initiated by a relatively small number of people, and therefore we're grappling with the fact that it's hard to guess what is going to come next. So I think it's important to know there's some legislative uncertainty. People really just don't know what to expect coming forward. From a studio owner's perspective, there's a significant amount of uncertainty. Good news on this is I think you're going to see as we go through this that our impact is on fewer areas than we would expect. We're really lucky that we are service-based businesses. If anything, I think this enables us to weather the storm really well, and as consumers adjust spending, since we're not something that has gone dramatically up in price, honestly, we probably have some real opportunities to win in this overall sense of uncertainty. Third bit of uncertainty is from a consumer's perspective. Consumers are of course, they've been grappling with more than just tariffs. They've been grappling with what's happened with the tariffs. So whether we're talking about the valuations of certain currencies around the world, whether we're talking about the stock market hitting highs and hitting lows and hitting everything in between, these are things that have led us to a point to say, hey, wait, we've got some issues that we're looking at from a consumer perspective. And if I'm being quite frank, this is where I'm focused a lot of my time and energy on wondering how is the consumer going to deal with. Little bit of a different conversation for many people. But the good news that we've got is that, when we look at the data around where people are willing to spend and where they're not in times of economic uncertainty, they're willing to spend for our services. NAB, which is a phenomenal Australian group of economists, has done some really powerful surveys around where people will spend, where they're going to invest their dollars, and where they won't. One thing that's really clear is that they are really willing to invest their dollars on things like private school, activities for their children, health insurance, care for their pets, housekeeping, and right above those things sits studio and gym services, fitness and health related services. We are actually one of the like last things people tend to cut. They're going to stop going out to dinner. They are going to stop going to the movies. They're going to scale back on trips. They're going to scale back on other shopping expenses. But in fact, going to fitness, which is a relatively low cost experience in comparison to going to a concert, going to see a play, going to dinner. There's a real opportunity that we have here to really say, hey, this is something that you can afford, and really something you must afford if we're looking at the overall long-term cost of your health in comparison to relatively minimal costs today on this. So knowing this conversation, let's talk a little bit about the history of tariffs. Now, I've got a lot of notes here, and I'm going to say, since I'm not someone who normally talks on tariffs, I'm going to be relying on these back and forth because I want to make sure I'm giving you everything in core detail. So just basics, understand tariff, a tax imposed by the governments on goods imported from another country, just so that we're being very, very, very clear on this. It's typically in percentage format. So based on the overall value of the goods, you're going to be taxed on 10%, 20%. In the case of China right now, 145% at current times. This is typically going to be something that, because they're paid by the importer in, so someone who is bringing them into the country. If you're a studio owner who is now bringing in goods from a foreign country, you are the person that is going to be responsible for paying these tariffs. It's why we've seen small business owners who are in the goods market. So they're in the retail market where they're bringing in goods from other countries. They've been reliant on having manufacturing in foreign countries because of costs and because of, quite frankly, in some cases, real experience and expertise, especially if they're in very specialty products. Now they are the ones who, in order to get them into the United States, if it's their market, or into any other countries, they are now paying the fees that go alongside of this. Now, here in the United States, for example, about $2.3 trillion worth of goods per year fall under these tariff laws. So a significant amount of goods that are coming up on this. But based on the country you're in, there's a good chance you've already been paying tariffs. And some of you, as we work in 48 countries, we've really grappled with this. So while we're seeing it in the United States, we're hearing the reverberations around this. There's a lot of countries we've been working in for a long time that have had mass tariffs bringing in, especially equipment. That's something that we've seen in Western Europe, where we've seen some pretty spiky tariffs as we've been opening studios. And I've gotten very conscientious of what countries we're bringing them in from, or whether we can go with an EU-based manufacturer versus someone who's outside of that bracket. So know that if you're sitting in a foreign country, you've probably already been grappling with it. It just hasn't gotten to the state where we're in the States, which is it's borderline getting into a trade war status, which means that we're using tariffs to really force significant changes with other countries. The tariff is the weapon that is being wielded on this. No doubt we've gotten to where we're at because, somewhere in the last, let's just say 10 to 20 years, people have gotten very concerned with the rise in manufacturing in China and the decrease in manufacturing in the United States. If we scroll back to when I was a child, quite literally, under the Clinton administration, there were some significant changes that allowed us to start importing in significant numbers with lessened tariffs from outside of the U.S. It shifted the entire manufacturing landscape here, and the goods that were typically made in the U.S. prior moved offshore. And people began building very specialty factories. In fact, I think, essentially for the last 30 years, many businesses have been building, highly specialized manufacturing offshore rather than onshore. As we starting to get concerned about the quantity that is moved offshore and even specific segments, one of the big ones that's come up recently is like the pharmaceutical segment, the sheer amount of drugs consumed in America that are legal drugs, let's be crystal clear on this, that are being manufactured in China and India. It's causing the country to say, hey, wait, do we want to have some shifts in this? When it comes to tariffs that you've likely been paying, there's a few I think you need to know about. So the first is the 301 tariff. So this was enacted in Trump's first administration. You've been paying these for some time. These were primarily against China. They were a rate of about 7.5 to 25%. In the Biden administration, these tariffs were upheld. In some cases, they were actually increased on this. These are clearly, did I do a good job knocking something over? They were like, God, we don't want to talk about tariffs. I got startled and scared for just a second. I love it. So you've been paying these for 7 to 8 years. As terrifying as they are, you probably haven't even noticed them. We've seen an overall goods and inflation adjustment to accommodate for them. These are clearly here to stay. Second tariffs you need to know about. These are the 232 national security tariffs. They primarily impact steel and aluminum. The idea of these tariffs, which basically tax steel and aluminum between 10 to 25%, is the idea that we would start to force things like aluminum smelting to be done in the U.S. rather than in Canada, to see increased steel manufacturing in the U.S. rather than other places. Now, this tariff was initially enacted in 2018. It was increased in February by 10 to 25%, depending on the specific good that was coming in. Biggest impact we see on this is, of course, on new construction, because we use an awful lot of steel in particular in new construction here in the United States. So if you're looking at opening a new studio, the fact of the matter is we do not have manufacturing capabilities for steel at the rates of which we're putting up commercial buildings, which is primarily what uses them. Therefore, we can expect commercial buildings to go up for a period of time. Just something to have an awareness of. Is it a direct impact? No, but it's certainly an indirect impact if you're looking to open your first studio, if you're expanding rapidly in the US, that we want to be aware of on this. Now, the big tariffs that I think have caused this conversation to actually happen were the International Emergency Economics Powers Act tariffs of Liberation Day. So this was April 3rd of this year, roughly a month ago. These came on board. Now, important to know, this was a promise that Trump made in his campaign. So this is not like necessarily a shock. Whether you voted for him or not, this was something that was a promise, and it's clear that he likes to uphold those promises. One of the big tenets was that in order to return manufacturing, really stabilize the ability to export from the United States, we were going to start wielding tariffs in a very different way. So part one of this tariff was an additional 10% tariff on all imports. And I think as I talk to more and more people, most people are convinced that that is a tariff that is going to stay. Reasonable amount. He's continuing to kind of increase and layer these on over and over and over for our trading partners. But the second part, which is what really caused the market to go into a tailspin, was the reciprocal tariffs. Now, for me, when I thought reciprocal, I assumed that if someone charged us a 40% tariff, we would then charge a 40% tariff. It's important to know that's not actually how the math on these reciprocal tariffs worked. Instead, based on the idea that America has some pretty strong restrictions around the world. Case in point, I'll give some great examples, of this. If I am opening a studio in Israel, I'm going to be incredibly restricted to what software and payment providers I can use, because there's a barrier that's literally in place as to what is allowed to be processed or done in Israel. If I'm a major company that's seeking to do business in Germany or seeking to do business in South Korea, I may or may not be allowed to do business. We were chatting with a really interesting lobbyist, been a lobbyist for brands like Airbnb and for Uber, having conversations on whether or not those services were going to be allowed into other countries. In many cases, it was just a flat out no. From an agricultural perspective, we bring in a lot of imports in. We are not allowed to export out. So there's some truth that many countries have made it difficult to do business with them if you are the United States and are seeking to import in on this one. But there was an idea that based on this and based on concerns around this, that there was a very much an academic exercise that if we base these reciprocal tariffs on trade imbalance rather than the tariffs that were actually being enacted by the other government, this would force other countries to open up certain industries to U.S. companies. Okay. Again, very academic, very much. This is something that I think I'm sure was developed in a think tank somewhere. But the idea was, hey, we're gonna treat it this way, and some industries that are not even allowed to be imported into other countries. This is going to force the conversation that a lot of people haven't wanted to have. Interestingly enough, I was up in DC when the US UK economic prosperity deal was announced on May 8th. It's proof that there is some truth that other governments are going to be offering some. They're certainly going to be offering some options to us. They are open for negotiations, and they are suddenly allowing things that they have not allowed many years. The UK government relented on agricultural goods that could be imported in, some aerospace goods and tariffs. The U.S. Did tariffs with limitations on this deal. So, for example, that 10% tariff, part one of this, was upheld. But, for example, on the U.K. car industry, they are labeling them to bring, up to the first 100,000 cars in from that were made in the U.K. into the U.S. Under those 10% tariffs rather than on an increased tariff. So it's interesting to see this real time. We're expecting to see a lot more of this. I think the deadline is in early July, where we're going to see much, much, much more of this. Now, there's some additional tariffs that really caused the great concern on this beyond. I guess everything caused concern now that I'm actually thinking about this. And those are going to be the additional Chinese tariffs. This is where the U.S. Imposed a 145% overall tariff on Chinese goods on this. So suddenly, if you order a reformer from China, you ordered custom shirts, you ordered weights, you ordered a security camera for outside, many of whose parts are made in China. You ordered a computer and parts of the hardware were made in China. You were seeing now suddenly some things are quite literally doubling, if not more, in cost on this. So major shifts and major changes. Now, no doubt we're heavily reliant on China. I was having a conversation with someone last night. I said, I just didn't realize how much we bought that came from China until suddenly, I'm on Amazon and I'm seeing, tariff surcharge. It's clear that this is going to have a bit of a bite, and it's done to really force China's hand and also force the greater American hand on manufacturing. It's a lot. As from a consumer and a small business owner, personally, it's scary. I told my son and my husband we were running a significant Meta ads push, and on April 3rd, our ad costs, because we were separated out of the U.S. and the international markets, just because we were concerned about this, our U.S. Ad cost per lead hit double what it has ever been in the history of Studio Grow. More so than the worst times of COVID, more so than we've ever seen on an election week or Black Friday or anything else. It was numbers that were going to be unsustainable for our business, and it was things that reverberated out. It wasn't a direct impact. Those tariffs weren't being charged on my ad dollars, but the market was responding and reacting, and people were really stepping back from this, and we paid that price. I think, really something that you want to be aware of is, yes, the direct implications of this, but even more so the indirect ones, which you're probably going to feel, as we did, much more on this. So what can we expect from the tariffs? So the 301, the 232, and that 10% IEEPA tariff are anticipated to stay. As we sat and visited with people in DC, I talked to a lot of Democrats, a lot of Republicans. Everyone came back and said, hey, these are things that long term, and to be quite frank, there's a lot of bipartisan support for those tariffs. That's something that people genuinely felt very, very, very comfortable with. Now, on these individual reciprocal tariffs, we know that there's an awful lot of countries that are in negotiation. We gave the example of the US-UK trade deal, which was the first to be announced. We're expecting significant more to be announced in the next 2 months on this. But I think that there's not going to be a surprise if there's going to be some type of increase on here. Everyone that we talk to on the Republican and the Democratic side, I suppose with the exception of one congressman, was very concerned about the randomness and the roller coaster ride of this, especially when we saw tariffs, being tweeted out as the announcements. It felt haphazard, like you could, be going along enjoying a cup of coffee and then want to, spit the coffee everywhere because you were suddenly at 145% tariff. So I think that that's something that has been jarring, and I think we're going to have to take as an overall from an overall sentiment, there's going to have to be a little bit of a, hey, this is going to be the way it's going to be for a bit. And you may have a little bit of a roller coaster that we go in, and there's going to have to be some comfort with the fact that we're on a little bit of a different ride than we have been on before. I would say that, what we have been told, and this was again came from both Democrats and Republicans, is that it's very likely that negotiations are going to happen. We have a president that has a club that he likes to swing. It is very clear that this is going to be his style of negotiations. This is what we could have expected from his first term. We could certainly expect it now. And it's made it clear that he knows that the tariff club is a very effective weapon against, any other countries in a geopolitical dispute. We've already seen this in Latin America. We know that his negotiation style is one that is a little bit more bombastic. And the more that he sees this work, the more willing he's going to be to use this. So have a knowledge base that, if you're looking around and going, oh my God, I think this is like something that, gives me an ulcer, which was how it was described to me by one of my friends recently. There's going to have to be some real thoughtfulness in regards to the fact that, yes, this is going to continue to happen. And of course, we need to make sure that we get just a little bit more comfortable with it. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to be an entrepreneur for the next 3 years and 7 months or so that we've got left in this administration. As we start to negotiate with other countries, friend shoring is going to be a very real thing. It means that, manufacturers that we may have been purchasing from, that we're doing business in China or we're having goods manufactured in China, already likely looking at moving those manufacturing facilities to countries that we're more friendly with, whether we're talking about moving from China to Vietnam or from China to Pakistan, or things like, we already know a lot of tech equipment has made some shifts. We know the importance of Taiwan in that, and so continuing to move to friendlier shores and friendlier places that those manufacturings are going to be. Now, will that happen instantaneously? No. So I will say that if you are readily bringing in goods that are manufactured in China, and for me, the biggest concerns are going to be equipment that's manufactured in China for new studios or replacement studios. If you have heavy amounts of retail that's been manufactured in China, these are going to be adjustments that you're going to want to be really looking for very quickly and considering where you can move this to. What does this mean for you? All right, first, good news are we are service-based businesses. Yes, many of us have retail. Yes, many of us are relying on goods, but you are not relying on goods 24/7. You are relying on the services you are providing. That is 110% in your favor. Second, I'm going to repeat this again because it is the most important part. There's going to be some uncertainty in the future. We can expect this for the remainder of this presidency. There's going to have to be some peace of mind and conversations. Something Dan and I have spent a lot of time talking about and looking at is, how are we personally going to deal with this? How are we going to handle this? How are we going to change our reactions? My mother, the therapist, has given lots of ideas. This is one where therapy may be in order for some of us as entrepreneurs. I would definitely recognize major brands are certainly looking, and they're saying, do I want to repurpose capital that I was going to use for certain expansions, certain major purposes, or do I want to wait on planning decisions? If you're a small business, you may not have that opportunity. If you knew you were going to be ordering new equipment and you knew it was coming from China, or you planned on doing that, that may shift you to, am I going to go with an alternative manufacturer who may have originally cost a little bit more, but now may be priced very similarly, that's perhaps manufacturing in Canada or the US, or again, a friendlier country on this. Certainly, if you have any type of goods that you are selling, I think I'd consider the play that was used by Amazon. Was not necessarily, I did not go over real well with the government when Amazon did this, but I think it's because it was such a strong tactic. Amazon added some really beautiful on their pricing, tariff style increases. They did a really good job of this. Amazon does pricing very well. They're always very psychologically friendly. And when you saw the tariff increase, what you did was you didn't get angry at Amazon, you got angry at the government that it had gone up. You also got to see, really clear the ramifications of this very quickly as a consumer. And so there was never a question that someone was trying to screw you, someone was trying to cheat you. Instead, it was very clear that this was a decision that was outside the bounds of the business. And I think that is where we go. We've talked on other episodes about the inflation trilemma that so oftentimes we're often faced with. Do we cut prices, cut margins, or cut corners? Nobody wants to do any of those things as a small business owner. I think that is what we're all trying to avoid. Instead, and this was a phenomenal Harvard Business School professor who talked about recalibrating the product stack, restructuring the brand, and replacing the pricing model as an alternative to that. So considering that if this is going to have an impact on the business, how do you do those three things instead of grappling with, how do I change and shift my pricing on this? This is something you absolutely want to reach out to your local legislative bodies on. And ideally, if you're in the US, we're talking about your congressmen and your senators that we're looking at. So when I say local to you, rather than actually your local government on this. So I would be having the same conversations I had with an awful lot of congressmen and senators that just, hey, I want to be really clear. These tariffs are causing a lot of uncertainty in my small business. When I was having these conversations, the things that I were bringing up were things of, hey, I don't know if I'm going to be able to open, new studios without significantly increased costs on both equipment and on actually building costs. That may stop me from producing new jobs, from paying more taxes, and from really growing the economy in my local area. Those are, I think, three magic catchphrases. Everyone would like to increase more revenue from taxes in their district. Everyone would like to have more jobs. Everyone wants to see a greater economic climate. When you can say that these decisions are really impacting you on all three, you're making a compelling case, and you're not looking for your voice to have somebody say, yes, I'm going to go change this tomorrow. It's not going to happen. Instead, you're looking for a groundswell of information to be swept up so that when there is compelling evidence that significant numbers of people are sharing this, that your voice was part of them. And I will say there's something psychologically, for me, it was like an enormous peace of mind to know that I was able to go and share. I was able to go and say, these are things I am concerned about. These are things that are causing potential damage. These are things that, I want someone to know. And having that, I can't tell you what that did to me as a business owner to be like, whoa, didn't necessarily change anything except the weight off of my chest. Now, certainly all of us are going to be watching some of the legal challenges, which are continuing to mount, both from a state perspective and from a small business owner perspective. I know I was just reading a very interesting one from Emily Lay, who is a calendar maker. I've had some of her calendars in the past. They are absolutely fabulous. And as she said, never thought I would be mounting a lawsuit against the president of the United States, but more and more people are starting to take that tack. And it's clear the government at some point is going to have to weigh, are the legal challenges versus the potential gains in the tariffs? Because they're looking at these tariffs not just as a way to shift manufacturing, but to also shift revenue upwards without increasing taxes. It's a key part of this academic exercise is, can another government, or those importing in pay for this in a very different way? that's where we see as a bigger shift that may come is if people start to realize, whoa, these legal challenges are just getting too big. Um, Again, am I an expert on tariffs? No. Do I know enough to be dangerous? Hopefully so, since I'm giving this podcast. But I hope this gives you a really good idea of where we're sitting in the boutique fitness industry in regards to the tariffs, where we're sitting in the overall fitness industry, and what this really means for you for the long term. If you've been listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, please hit subscribe. Share this with as many people as you can, because God knows I would like the peace of mind to spread. And finally, give us a review. Share why you've loved this, because we can't wait to hear what has impacted you and your studio.